A supervolcano eruption today would cause global chaos and result in the death of millions of people. But what exactly is a supervolcano? And why should we be concerned about them? For starters, there are no official definitions of what constitutes a supervolcano. However, they're generally considered to be any volcano capable of producing an eruption magnitude 8 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, or VE, which describes the height of the eruption column and the volume of material erupted. So basically, we're talking about volcanoes that could blow their tops off and cover the entire planet in ash if they wanted to. But don't worry, because there aren't many of these supervolcanoes around the world, and none of them have shown signs of waking up anytime soon. In fact, according to recent studies, only 3 of these monsters exist in the world today. They are Yellowstone National Park in the United States, Mount Vesuvius in Italy, and the Taupo volcanic zone in New Zealand. Each one of these volcanoes has the potential to end human civilization as we know it, if they were to erupt. However, for the sake of this exercise, let's imagine that a supervolcano did erupt today. It will help us understand how our modern society would respond to such a natural disaster, and what we could do to mitigate the damage. First, we need to discuss what happens during a typical supervolcanic eruption. Although there are very few historical records of these eruptions, scientists believe that the largest eruption in recorded history was that of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815. This event unleashed about 50 cubic miles of ash into the atmosphere, enough to cover the whole country of France and more than 6 feet of debris. For months, people in Europe experienced constant darkness during the day as thick ash blocked out the sun. The eruption also caused massive climate change, triggering the year without summer in 1816, which led to crop failures, famine, and disease. Tambora's eruption killed over 100,000 people, and if it happened today, the impact would be much worse. The first danger comes from the eruption itself, which would level entire cities and cover vast areas in molten lava, pyroclastic flows, falling volcanic bombs, and toxic gases. The blast wave from the explosion could travel at the speed of sound and cause major damage within 300 miles of the volcano. Primary cities near the volcano would be destroyed completely, and even those located thousands of miles away would suffer significant structural damage to buildings and other infrastructure. Planes flying in the blast radius would be obliterated, and although most major airports would remain operational, air traffic would be severely disrupted by the ash cloud. Next comes the ash cloud, which would contain small solid particles of rock and glass called tephra. These particles would remain suspended in the atmosphere for months, blocking sunlight and causing temperatures around the world to drop by several degrees. Unlike the normal cycle of seasons, which sees the northern hemisphere tilt towards the sun and experience warmer weather, a supervolcanic eruption would lead to a prolonged winter season characterized by constant rainfall, high winds, and unseasonable storms. Scientists predict that a large eruption at Yellowstone, for example, would cause global temperatures to plummet between 6 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit for up to 2 years. Even if a similar eruption occurred in another part of the world, the consequences would be devastating. For instance, a major eruption in New Zealand would cause temperatures to drop between 18 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit for up to 5 years. And the situation would be further complicated by the lack of sunlight, because clouds would reflect the weak light reaching the Earth's surface, causing perpetual twilight conditions. Aside from the immediate dangers of a supervolcanic eruption, there would be serious long-term consequences. Since crops depend on consistent temperature and sunlight to grow, a sudden change in weather patterns would lead to widespread crop failure and food shortages around the world. Some regions might experience colder, wetter conditions, while others could face warmer, drier weather. Either way, the growing season would be significantly altered and agricultural production would decline. As supplies dwindled, famine would become widespread and millions of people would starve to death. Adding to the chaos, a supervolcano eruption would trigger massive earthquakes and tsunamis. The violent shaking of the ground could lead to secondary disasters like landslides and collapsing bridges and buildings. On top of that, The explosion could generate giant tsunami waves that wipe out coastal communities within minutes. In the best-case scenario, governments would take drastic measures to save as many lives as possible. The military would be deployed to maintain order and protect vulnerable populations. Airports and transportation systems would be shut down and mass evacuations would be ordered for areas surrounding the volcano. Shelters would be set up to accommodate displaced people, and emergency food and water rations would be distributed to the public. Search and rescue teams would scour the rubble looking for survivors. Medical services would be mobilized to treat the injured and prevent the spread of infectious diseases. But unfortunately, these efforts wouldn't be enough to save everyone. Millions of people would lose their lives, and even more would be left homeless. And after the dust settled, we'd be left with a devastated planet. Vast areas would be uninhabitable due to the heavy ash covering the ground. Survivors would have to contend with the toxic remnants of the eruption and rebuild their lives from scratch. The global economy would collapse and trade routes would be severed. Without functioning transportation systems and enough food to go around, the world would descend into chaos. Looting, riots, and civil unrest would become commonplace. Governments would struggle to maintain control, and some countries might even collapse entirely. It's hard to imagine how we'd cope with the aftermath of such a disaster. We should also consider the indirect consequences of a supervolcanic eruption. For instance, with crops failing and food supplies dwindling, desperate governments could turn to less savory means to feed their populations. Reports have surfaced that North Korea has considered selling babies for food and cannibalizing their citizens in the event of a famine. China, too, has reportedly looked into the possibility of harvesting the organs of prisoners to sell on the black market as a source of revenue. With nothing to lose, rogue states might engage in aggressive military action and spark a global conflict. Nuclear weapons could be deployed and humanity could be pushed to the brink of extinction. All of this sounds pretty bleak, and it's no wonder why supervolcanoes are considered to be among the deadliest natural disasters in history. But let's take a moment to appreciate just how unlikely it is that a supervolcano will erupt in our lifetime. First of all, there are relatively few supervolcanoes in the world, and none of them is overdue for an eruption. Yes, Yellowstone, for instance, erupts on average every 640,000 years. But its last major eruption occurred 630,000 years ago, so it's not about to blow its top anytime soon. At Mount Vesuvius, the time between eruptions averages 20,000 years, with the last major eruption occurring 19,000 years ago. Meanwhile, the Taupo volcanic zone erupts on average every 265 years, with its last major eruption taking place 280 years ago. There is no scientific evidence that any of these supervolcanoes are showing signs of waking up. Even if they did, we have developed advanced monitoring systems that would give us plenty of warning before an eruption. Plus, with modern technology, we could develop effective countermeasures to mitigate the damage. Planes could be grounded, roads could be evacuated, and computer models could be used to predict the path of the eruption. Of course, there's no guarantee that these measures would be successful, but it's always better to be prepared than caught off guard. Now, check out 7.7 billion people, a problem. What happens if half of humanity suddenly vanishes? Or watch 7.7 billion people, a problem. How does the world end? For more videos like these,